Surprise! Welcome to a bonus Bituation Room podcast live. I am your host, Francesca Fiorentini. This is comedian and life partner, Matt Lieb.
Hey! And it's a bonus episode because I'm on it. I'm never in the main show. I'm only a bonus guest.
You know why? Because you can roll with anything.
I roll with the punches, Mm-hmm. You get it in you one day to be like, I want to do a bonus episode.
Yeah.
And then you just scream down the hall, Matt!
Yeah.
Come in, we're doing a bonus! And I'm like, okay. Mm-hmm. I wasn't doing anything.
You're playing...
I was playing Ghost of Tsushima.
Ghost of Tsushima.
Tsushima.
Yeah. If anyone wants to watch Matt play Ghost of Tsushima, he should probably start a Twitch channel.
Tsushima, that's what it's called. It's a small island off of the mainland of Japan, and it's a really fun game.
Anyway, the reason I wanted to go live on this bonus is because, I know y'all want to watch the RNC. I don't want to interrupt your hate watching and your beautiful viewing. Lara Trump is a Category 4 hurricane that is barreling into Houston right now. No, but we wanted to talk to a good friend and mentor of mine, Max Elbaum, who wrote this book, Revolution in the Air. I wanted to take the full hour to pick his brain, to talk about the Democratic National Convention, the Republican National Convention, the future of progressive movements in this country, the future and the hopes and prospects for real change. Why we're suddenly talking about Marxism all of a sudden? Why is the RNC
obsessed with
Marxism one day to the next? Obviously, we can't ignore what's going on right now in Kenosha and the murder of Jacob Blake. And the murder of 2 other activists or protesters by militia. We will have a show on Sunday that also addresses that. But right now, the man, the myth, the legend, he's an author. He is an activist. He is a great guy. Again, he's my mentor. And if you don't have Revolution in the Air, you need this book. It is great. Please welcome to the Bituation Room, Max Elbaum.
Hi.
Hey.
Oh, hi.
How you doing, Max?
It's a schizophrenic life right now. My own corner is good, but the world is a mess.
Right.
That sounds about right. I feel like we can all relate to that.
Every time I feel joy, I feel guilty. Like, oh no.
Yeah. The world's on fire, but we moved into a really nice new apartment. So things are looking up.
It doesn't help the world, for you to feel bad about being in a good situation doesn't help the world at all. So you should feel good about it and leverage it. That's what you're doing.
Yeah. I want to welcome everyone watching on Facebook. We're doing this live on Facebook for the first time. Usually we do bonus episodes on YouTube and Twitch, but welcome. Thank you for being here and for your comments and for watching this instead of the RNC.
Yeah. Also, consider deleting your account.
Yeah.
Because Facebook is bad. Facebook melt your brain.
Facebook will melt your brain. Max, do you have any friends who have been radicalized by Facebook? Because it's not about, every time I talk about boomers, people get very mad, but people of a certain age, milieu, tend to spend a lot of time on Facebook.
Good use of milieu.
And believe all of the things that it's telling them. And all of the ways that it's tracked. Do you have like that one friend? I know you're steeped in amazing radical history and movements, and you've got some of the coolest friends from a lifetime of dedication to revolutionary struggle. But do you have one who like just went off the deep end and became like a right winger?
Yes. I know people from the 60s who I was with in SDS and other radical movements then who later moved pretty far to the right. Yes.
Wow.
Unfortunately, that's the case.
You say that I
taught nuclear war strategy at the Naval War College.
What was that?
One taught nuclear war strategy at the Naval War College.
Damn.
So he was teaching at the point at which he was teaching naval war strategy. He was left wing, or he?
No, he went all the way.
That was where he moved on to.
That's where he made his heel turn, as to use a professional wrestling term.
Well, before we get into everything, I mean, I want to ask, because we have to open every show with what are you bitching about. So let's go around. Matt, you want to start?
Yeah, sure.
What are you bitching about?
I'm bitching about the recent announcement that the NBA is going on strike. Not the fact that the players are going on strike, but that the comments from mostly white people with tactical sunglasses are making, on Twitter is just it consistently blows my mind that the idea of kind of like athletes showing solidarity with people who are, being shot in the streets by cops, showing solidarity with people who are fighting against police brutality is always met with the same, white tactical sunglasses looking dude who's just like, I got some crime statistics you could look at. I have a statistic. This is my statistic. 100% of people who post crime statistics on Twitter are racist pieces of shit.
With Asian wives.
Yeah,
and they have to tell you about their Asian wives.
Yeah, because the Asian wife ensures you can't be racist.
Yeah, they always, Max, do you know this, that if you aren't racist, you have to marry a person of color and put that in your bio that you are married to that person of color. And
And then in like your bio, you write happily miscegenated. And then you're supposed to, that's how you know that you're not racist.
Well, this is why I come on this show, because I learned something in the first 5 minutes. Thank you.
But yeah, shout out to LeBron James, which is something I never thought I'd say because I'm not a big LeBron James fan. But shout out, not his politics, but I just, as a basketball guy. But yeah, shout out to him for, helping to organize the players to strike in solidarity with, the recent shooting in Kenosha.
Yeah.
Well, how about a shout out to the Milwaukee Bucks? That's my home team. I grew up in and they got the ball rolling on this.
They did.
And, I watched the Milwaukee Bucks game in 1971. That's the last professional basketball game I've been to.
Wow.
When I lived in Milwaukee at the time.
71. So was that the Kareem team?
That's right. That's the one time I actually got to see Kareem play in the same stadium. That was a real highlight.
That was awesome. That was the year I think they won, right?
He's out there waiting and pitching and doing really good politics. You read his columns. So, and he's really proud of those Milwaukee Bucks today.
Yeah, I imagine so.
Max, I know you've got a similar bitch or a bitch in the same vein. What are you bitching about?
Well, when I grew up in Milwaukee and Kenosha and Racine, the other two industrial cities on the Lake Michigan there, that was before deindustrialization. I mean, there was plenty of segregation and plenty of racism, but there were union jobs and there was a road, especially for African Americans, into making a decent living and home ownership. And it was a very hopeful time with some of the gains that were made in the 60s. And it's painful to see your hometown and the other places that I spent some time in. I had friends who lived in Kenosha and Racine. It's right down the road. It's painful to see that. And what's happening now, I mean, you said it. I mean, the alliance of the police and the militias shooting people down in the streets. Yeah.
Yeah. So. I've got a similar bitch. I think we're kind of all just upset about the same thing, which makes sense. And I just can't believe, there are videos, here's the thing about, a lot of video-based news stories are at once incredibly important to watch and also very upsetting. And also, I am not of the ilk of what happened before this video or what happened after, but, for sure, it's important to get a full picture of a story. I'm not talking about the murder of Jacob Blake, but this militia, the sort of militia, if you can call it that, armed white guy in tactical glasses coming out unsolicited, and the complicity between them and the police. And I was like, well, how can we say that there was complicity? And then there's two separate videos. One of them where one of the militia guys like, well, the police told me that they were going to push the protesters in our direction and we were going to take care of them. Yeah. And then, and he might've been lying. He might've been blustering.
Bet $1 million he's not.
But he might also, then there's another video of, a military or police tank, and they're saying, do you want any water? Mm-hmm. Do you need water? And they're offering these militiamen water.
It reminded me of who was the Charleston shooter?
Dylan Roof.
Dylan Roof being taken out for McDonald's after being arrested for doing a mass murder.
Yeah.
It's just like this constant coddling and nothing but empathy and understanding from one white supremacist group to another. And
this is, I think, where it gets very scary. I think if you're Black in America, you've understood the links much more up close. But I think it becomes very chilling when, and I think we've reached the, we're sort of at the Rubicon here when it comes to fully knowing and understanding the legacy and the surviving legacy of police being part and parcel of white supremacy and enforcing and policing and shooting and killing Black Americans. But there's always there's some good cops, and aren't they? They're not always the same thing. And then you see that there's this awful tag team that, to be fair, people who've been protesting white supremacy, like Antifa, have seen that for years now. They've seen the ways that when there is a white supremacist march and then they go to counter protest, the police will protect the white supremacists. But it's a good jumping off point for what I want to talk to you about, Max, which is this political moment and your book, because we're working on a new season of Newsbroke, and Matt wrote something recently that I thought was really funny, which was he called 1968 Nerf 2020. So practice 2020 as the most sort of runner up for the second most volatile year.
Right.
In
1968 used to, be like, oh, if you want to talk about a crazy volatile year in American history, it was always every year was, well, it's no 1968. 2020 might be the closest contender that I've seen. But I don't know. That's coming from someone who didn't live through 1968 and only knows about it through documentaries and the movie Forrest Gump.
Well, 2020 has surpassed 1968, in my opinion, on all kinds of levels, which is not to take anything away from 1968, but it's the comment, the scale and scope of 1968, of 2020. Yeah. So on the one hand, on the protest side, this protest movement, the uprising to defend Black lives, had kicked off after George Floyd was murdered. It's, on the front page of the New York Times that it's the largest mass movement in U.S. history. And I think that's true. The level of participation of people of all backgrounds following Black leadership, the level of conversation about coming to grips for the first time with the history of what the Civil War even meant, which was not done at the scale that it's being done today. In looking back at that, it's become a mainstream thing ever since the New York Times and the 1619 Project. So if you want to look at it that way. And on the other side, the level of polarization, partly because the information systems are now completely separate than they were in 1968. In 1968, everybody still watched CBS, ABC, and NBC.
Yeah.
And of course, people had antagonistic opinions about what was going on, but there was a single sort of news reference point. That's completely gone. If you spend time on Fox News, you're living in an alternative reality. And right now, Fox News is being criticized by the far right of being too centrist. And there's that other OAN that's come in there. And the other thing that's going on here, which I think is very important is that even the white supremacists and the reactionaries in 1968, they felt they had a backup plan. If they had to concede the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, they were not in danger of their world falling apart. The country was still 75, 80% white. The U.S. was the most powerful economic country in the world, was unchallengeable in that respect. So although you don't want to underestimate the level of violence and antagonism toward the protest movements, it was a different psychology. On the right today, they really do believe that their civilization is at stake.
Yeah.
And it's driven by a lot. It's certainly been driven by propaganda. It's driven by the messages that come from the billionaires and all of that kind of stuff. But it's driven, I think, especially by demographic change.
Sure.
The country is changing demographically. The proportion of people of color is growing, is 20% more than it was. It's up, and it's projected to be a majority people of color country in another 20 or 30 years if current demographic trends continue.
Yeah.
And there's an incredibly large layer of the population, mostly white people who are older, since the younger generation has grown up. One of the gains of the 60s is at least younger people grow up in a more multiracial context than we did.
Absolutely.
It's certainly a different context on the mass media and television and the different roles that people play in society. The older white people, by and large, are still living in Leave It to Beaver land. That's considered normal America, real America.
Yeah.
And they, the psychology that their world is falling apart, it's also got to do with the fact that, you know, Vietnam was traumatic for the U.S. society and especially for the right and the war makers. But they were coming off still a lot, you know, World War II and victories. The United States hasn't won a war for 40, 50, 60 years.
Yeah.
It can destroy things, but it never wins anything. And
we can't even win the coronavirus war. We've pulled out of that war as well.
So there's a level of desperation on the other side, by any means necessary, that's different from 1968. And it's it's much more akin to what the secessionists who were the slavocracy felt when Lincoln was elected in 1860. That psychology, that level of what they considered their way of life was under threat. I don't think it's comparable in that sense to the 1960s. It's comparable to the 1860s. And I think that's giving this an incredible edge on their side. And then all the things on our side as far as the uprising and the deeper understanding of how systemic the problems are that's come out and been exacerbated by the pandemic.
Yeah. So what you're saying is it's worse. And
Civil War is coming.
And Civil War is coming. Cool. I think you are very so right. Whereas in 68, that, for lack of a better term, not the Cultural Revolution, but a revolution of culture was taking hold, that the myths about America were still sort of intact. I mean, I think you go into, in your book, Revolution in the Air, that everyone should read, the ways that the myth of America being the good guy was very much crumbling. And I think right now we've been able to maintain that America is the good guy. In the world, we've lost it, but in sort of internally, because hey, people of color and immigrants can still make it here. Look at Nikki Haley and all the other, tokens that are being trotted out by the RNC, which all
right-wing Cubans.
All right-wing, exactly.
Look at all the right-wing Cubans who are doing
so
well.
Latino, and it's just like, it's unclear who they're talking to. Are they trying to get people of color, or what it really feels like is they're trying to talk to white people and say, look, we're not coming for your stuff. This is fine. We still believe in the American dream, even though we've got more inequality than we did during the Great Depression, and so I think we're seeing, it's so funny just because hearing night after night the RNC repeat these myths, and a little bit same with the Democrats repeating the myth that like, hey, we're going to get through this. Yeah, we've got the best spirit in the world. And it's like, I don't know, man. I don't know if anything, I don't know if that myth of equality, we know that's being completely unraveling in front of our eyes. So you're right that it is a hard time because there aren't new figures and myths, and not myths, but there aren't new principles to latch on to unless we, actually uphold the civil rights leaders and figures that we should be currently and throughout history.
Yeah, we've got a lot of, I feel like a lot of the American psyche at this point needs to prop up these zombie myths, these myths that have long since been proven to be myths and untrue and dead. And rather than kind of like coping with it and coming to, an understanding about, our own history, we've decided, at least on the right, to double down on the myths, no matter how factually incorrect they are.
Yeah, all you have is that belief. I mean, this is the thing with Obama that I thought was interesting, was Obama was starting to get the country used to the idea that we live in a multipolar world and that we trade economically with the world, whether or not, we believe in, free trade deals, which was the one area that he and the Republicans were very much in line on. Pretty much the only time Republicans would ever defend Obama was over the TPP. Yeah. But without being explicit, it's almost like we need an actual talking to, hey, there's a whole world out there. You aren't number one, and you've got a lot to learn from the world. And by the way, your history isn't great. So anyway, hand holding. Yeah. Please put down your gun. But for sure, the person we have in office, Max, is leading us down this path of race war, essentially. This is where we're headed. I don't know if we've had someone, we've had Nixon years were bad. Reagan years were bad. Lots of dog whistling. I don't know if there's still a whistle involved in the kind of race baiting that we're seeing from this president.
No, there's no whistle there. It's a foghorn. I mean, they're pretty explicit. When you invite two people from St. Louis whose only claim to political fame is that they got their guns out and waved them at the Black Lives Matter protesters who were marching past their house peacefully. When those kind of people get invited to speak at the Republican National Convention, there's a direct line between that and what just happened in Kenosha.
Absolutely.
The message that is being sent from the RNC is basically the message that was sent by the Klan under Jim Crow, which is the blacks are coming to take your house and rape your women. Get your guns out and fight back. And that's the signal that's coming from the RNC. Now, the tricky thing that we have is, and that signal is what gives those cops who shot Jake in the back and that militia guy, the signal is we've got your back. You can do whatever you want.
Yeah.
That's exactly what's coming from that end. And then the tricky part for us, because I think you're absolutely right, Francesca, the only way to, if you want to, you have to root yourself in American history if you're going to change America. And we have to root ourselves in the resistance struggles that have existed since the period when the Native Americans resisted genocide and Africans who were enslaved. And at that, before racial slavery became fully consolidated, some of the white indentured servants joined together to try to fight for a different vision. And we have to tap into that thread in American history. Sitting Bull, Frederick Douglass, that whole kind of thing, which points to a systemic change. there are people who are against Trump, certainly in the ruling elite, but a significant section still of the populace in the middle and working classes, who are both white and people of color, who share the idea that Trump and that narrative is just totally racist and horrible. And they also don't think it's viable. You know, a government that relies on terror and force has lost the political battle. It's just relying on repression. You know, you read Chomsky, manufacturing consent. That works better. You get people to support the thing. So there's a whole wing of the ruling class. Obama is certainly a representative who believes that the Trump agenda, besides that he does feel that it's wrong and racist, that it's unstable for continuing American domination of the world, that you have to bring in people from different ethnicities. You have to have a more participatory thing, not even strictly from a narrow political point of view, but how do you get, you know, there's all these articles in the business press about these policies are terrible because other countries will get the brains from all around the world. I mean, the United States, you know, the post-World War II economic boom was partly built by all the people who came here or were brought here, including the ex-Nazis who built the space program and the atomic bomb stuff and all of that.
With your friend.
Friedrich von Braun.
They were a magnet. When that's gone, other countries become that. So there's a sector of people who still believe in U.S. capitalism, but they're against Trump. And
I wish China wanted all our Nazis. You know, like the next superpower would just take the old superpowers Nazis. Then we could just ship all of the crazies over there.
Except for our Nazis don't know how to make bombs anymore. They only know how to meme.
Yeah, they know how to make like shields that say "Save the children."
Yeah, they only know how to make your Twitter avatar into something Greek, like a Greek statue.
God, I mean, one thing that you said, I'm just going to keep coming back to the book because I've got so many questions about it. One thing you said in it was that America's largely a pretty conservative country. And that struck me. And I don't know, sometimes, let me just be real with you. Sometimes when I hear and see this amount of insanity, I'm like, why do we fight for this place? Like, why? What? Why are we? Maybe we'll just never get there, you know? And I know that those are in my depressed moments when I feel like, why do we still fight for this country that is so conservative and is so wrong and it like has Fox News behind all of the insanity and would rather believe in conspiracy theories like QAnon than, I don't know, than believing that all, you know, that Black Lives Matter, for example, that actually all lives matter. So I was wondering like how you reconcile with that. How do you stare down these nut jobs and say, yeah, man, it's worth fighting for still, you know, that
what keeps you going is what
I don't know. Maybe it's not even a question. It's just sort of wondering, like, I think there's been a lot of narrative like, well, if we just talk about working class issues, we can all get around that, right? What about healthcare? What about the fact that maybe a lot of the country just is conservative and unable to be reached and will die on the hill of white fragility forever and ever and ever, you know, from their cold dead hands, their whiteness.
Well, first of all, making systemic and revolutionary change is hard in any country. So it's not like anybody's got a simple job. And there have been, you know, some of the most dedicated people and most courageous people in the world have fought for a systemic change for 150 years, and here we are. So, you know, it's not like we have some things tougher than other people, but there are some ways in which certainly for us up until recently, it's been easier in some respects, or it's certainly been easier for some sections of the population in terms of being radical. But there's material reasons why the United States is the kind of country that it is. It's got to do with settler colonialism. It's got to do with the fact that the so-called frontier, which was a product of Native American genocide, offered white people tremendous opportunities to get land and get rich, where when you have a racial caste system, Isabel Wilkerson's new book about caste, whether you want to, whatever terminology you want to use, when you have a racially coded proletariat enslaved or in Jim Crow, there's a lot of room for the white people to do a lot better, which is the material basis for all that. It's also the reason that the kind of individualism flourishes in the United States. Even in the capitalist countries of Europe, you don't have that, because there wasn't that whole libertarian vision of freedom of you just went out to the Wild West, you killed the Indians, and you had your ranch, and that was, the American dream, something like that. So there's material reasons. And there's also material reasons now why the protest movements and people are turning toward more radical ideas. And while there's a whole wave of sympathy for socialism and systemic change, and it has to do with the levels of inequality that have been identified, it has to do with climate change and people feeling the threat to the future of the planet. It has to do with the way that the economy has evolved, where you have these incredible riches. I mean, this is something, this is old school Marxism, but capitalism has developed the point where the productive forces or the ability of science to solve so many problems, what's lacking is the political will to harness that in service.
Hello, Silicon Valley.
The thing. People, Grace Lee Boggs and James Boggs wrote about that in the 60s. I mean, it takes different forms and different currents on the left.
Yeah.
But the idea that there is tremendous potential to solve the problems if you could amass the political will and fight the political forces who hurt all mankind to save their own, as Curtis Mayfield put it in my favorite song from the 60s, people get ready. So we're here and we have to jump. We seize on those threads that are the positive potential. The other thing we have here is, it's hard to build an internationalist movement, but there are sectors of the U.S. population that have an organic connection to the rest of the world. There's no accident that Pan-Africanism and that African Americans have identified and been in solidarity with Africa numerous times and back and forth. The African people in Africa being in solidarity with U.S. struggles. Some of the most militant labor struggles in the last 20, 30 years have been driven by immigrants from Central America and Latin America who have experience with radical movements there and bring that culture here. In Asian communities, it's complicated because of how Vietnam came down and so on. But certainly in the 60s, the movements in the Philippines, in Vietnam, and what people identified with the Chinese Revolution, I mean, the Asian American left probably had more relative influence within Asian American life than any other movement except for the Black movement within the Black freedom movement and the Black community. So there are all kinds of things that we can leverage if we get it together that can move things in another direction. There's a section of the population, absolutely, that is not going to move. But if you get governmental power, even if you're not completely controlling it, you have tools to neutralize some of the sectors that are in your opposition. You do certain programs that benefit them along with your core constituencies, and it neutralizes some of the hostility. It doesn't change their ideas overnight, but it means that if if there is a program, which is not completely out of the question if Trump loses, between pressure from the left and the self-interest of a Biden administration, which realizes if it doesn't do something to move things, it's not going to survive.
Yeah.
Right.
Certain things.
And not only that, is it not going to survive? It's going to set us up for an authoritarian with a better plan, right, than Trump, an authoritarian who can really back up the bluster.
Absolutely. So they have an interest in also because the other side is such a mafia type operation. When they talk about throwing the Hillary Clintons, the Jeff Bezoses, and the Hunter Bidens in jail, they're not kidding. We take that, that's just within the ruling class. That means something to those people. They think that they're going to be, they look at other countries and see what happens when an authoritarian family regime gets in there. Look what's happening in Saudi Arabia, or look what happens in Russia, where, authoritarian regimes don't represent whole ruling classes. They represent one little faction, and they
just
wipe out other ones.
Yeah. Just nepotistic.
It's a family thing. So you can see that if you move in the direction of a Green New Deal, if you move in the direction of some serious healthcare reform, universal healthcare, even if it's not yet Medicare for all, you neutralize sections of the opposition bloc because they benefit from that too. Now, that doesn't eliminate the need to do the ideological work and all the other things, but you have certain tools to do that with. This is why holding governmental power matters.
Yes. I wanted to ask you about that, Max, actually. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's fine.
And you can jump in anytime you want, Matt. One thing looking back at the 60s and 70s, and I want to talk about Marxism a little bit, because now we talked about how it's become such this buzzword at a time when so many people are turning to socialism and are like, Marxism makes sense. But why weren't there more electoral victories in the 60s and 70s? That one always, it strikes me. Was it because the movements sort of discredited and discounted the electoral sphere because they were kicked out of it? But you have Nixon winning, then of course Reagan nailing the nail in the coffin at a time when, in your book, as you talk about, so many young revolutionaries felt that they were on the precipice of a massive revolution, something completely different, and they got it wrong. Was it because we gave up that sphere, or is it because we were kicked out of it? What was that dynamic?
Well, I think the main thing that happened is that the ruling class still had a lot of resources, and they regrouped fairly quickly. And everyone underestimated their ability to regroup. So they pulled off a fairly sophisticated withdrawal from Vietnam at the cost of tremendous life. I mean, destroying the country. But from their point of view, they played a smart geopolitical game. They busted up the socialist camp, the Sino-Soviet split. Nixon took advantage of that in a way that benefited the U.S. ability to recoup. And domestically, they enlisted the entire ruling class, or almost all of it, in a counteroffensive against the gains of the 1960s. So the main thing that was going on, it's like the title of that Walter Mosley book, Always Outnumbered, Always Outgunned. We were outnumbered and outgunned. So that's the main thing. But you're right, within the movement, there was a problem of a bifurcation, which is sections of the movement that had been in the far left, where I was located, and others, tended to see that the electoral system was completely blocked, and were influenced by the fact that in the 60s, it was the non-electoral movements that drove things, and underestimated the importance, if you were going in over the long haul, of having a foothold in the electoral system where you had elected officials and it gave you a permanent representation, and you could have your politics out there, and it would give you some stability and also force you to interact with what's really on the minds of the constituencies you have to deliver something to.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, there were new openings in politics for people who had political ambitions. And it was very easy. The system was still strong enough that a lot of people who were radical did go into, people who worked in the anti-Vietnam War movement, people who worked in the civil rights movement, went into electoral politics, got themselves elected, and generally moved to the right.
Right, they all got
pulled. They got pulled to the right. And it was also the period, don't forget, that now there was, off the Black Power movement, Black mayors were elected, Black city officials that had never been elected before, at the same time that economic resources were being pulled out of the cities.
Yeah.
And between the federal government policies, deindustrialization, and white flight, Black Power inherited those cities at a time when they were going bankrupt. Not because of any problem. It's the same line that was used in Reconstruction back in the 1860s, 70s. The new problems that the new governments had were blamed on the people who inherited a hell of a mess because it was caused by the system itself.
And someone, Upright Man on YouTube, says the war on drugs happened, which is a great point. In addition,
drugs, absolutely. And so you end up, that split got healed somewhat in the 80s with the Jesse Jackson campaigns and the interface between the anti-apartheid movement, the Central America solidarity movements, the Rainbow Coalition, the electoral work, movement around Palestine. There were a number of things that a lot of people there was a coming together of some forces who had been on the inside gain and drifted a bit to the right, and the far left come together in the rainbow. But by that time, it was very, very difficult. There were some incredible experiences, mostly the Harold Washington experience in Chicago, which was trench warfare around race and racism during the period of Washington's administration. So there were some places where electoral work
George Washington
combined.
Which Washington?
Harold Washington was the mayor of Chicago.
Okay, yes. I'm like, who? Yeah.
Until he died of, a heart attack, and that was a tragic loss. But by that time, Reagan had consolidated power nationally, and it was just much more difficult. So we all made mistakes in the late 60s. Every political force didn't, we didn't understand what was happening, but our opponents didn't completely understand it either.
But they had more resources, so they were able to,
exactly.
they were able to get it done.
So now, this is another thing that's so exciting about the current movements. They're more holistic. They're more inclusive. I just got an email today from the Movement for Black Lives. No Black liberation without trans liberation, or no Black Lives Matter without Black trans lives matter. I mean, you couldn't have had that in the 1960s. It was just not. That was off the table.
Right.
Half of the movement didn't know what a transgender person was. I mean, that was not, in the mix. So it's much more inclusive on gender issues and many other issues of ableism, issues of intergenerational dynamics. It's much more inclusive. It's got broader support, and most of the movement is not willing to cede any side of terrain to the enemy. It's going to fight on the electoral front. It's going to fight in the streets. And it's going to arm themselves in self-defense. There are people who are doing that, the Deacons for Defense, the same as the Panthers and other people did in the Deacons for Defense in the 1960s. So most people have realized that, you have to engage on every battlefront has got to be engaged. You don't cede any of that to the enemy.
So what I'm hearing is I should buy a gun. Should I buy a gun?
All
right, I won't buy a gun.
not giving individual advice on things like that. But,
I mean, but like, I also think that in a lot of ways, the repression, COINTELPRO, the assassinations of Black leaders in the 60s and 70s, truly, I think, flex the power of the repressive state in the way that we see on the streets today, that, to be honest with you, as just a person who doesn't want to die, makes me immediately go into the like, oh, well, maybe we should do the electoral thing, because that feels less scary than this state machinery that will and has, kicked into high gear against you. So in some ways, I feel like, and I'm not saying that like the lesson of the 60s was that armed revolution doesn't work necessarily, but it is, I do feel like if you want to play ball on the like who's got bigger weapons and more of them, we know who's going to win that every single time. This is a longer conversation and a different conversation, but I do feel like it's that amount of repression, that makes people stay home, which is sad, because it makes people, that amount of repression that makes people not be militant and do a direct action or civil disobedience or risk getting arrested, that we know is nonviolent, but it is a militant form of nonviolence. But it also, it tames, it's like Egypt now, right? It's very like, it tames a population. So anyway, I wonder about that. I wonder if we look back and are like, well, we don't want to end up like this.
You're everything you said is right, but you're combining some things together that have to be separated out. The masses of people will always choose a less risky road over a riskier one, until the less risky road, till millions of people are convinced that it's completely blocked. And that's sensible. That's not wrong or cowardly. That's completely sensible, because a struggle that takes a violent form always hurts women, children, the poor, the most vulnerable, the most.
Yeah.
The stance of the left is always to have the struggle proceed on the most nonviolent, most democratic level possible. This is our goal, because that meets the actual needs and feelings of the people we're accountable to. Ordinary people who want to get on with their life and their families and are not going to take risks unnecessarily. When millions of people get convinced that the less risky roads are blocked and that they can't meet their essential needs without upping the ante, if you want to use that phrase, that's when people turn to that. In Vietnam, the National Liberation Front in Vietnam, after the crazy agreements were signed with the Americans, spent years before they turned to armed struggle, trying to win what they had essentially won, and then got, the Geneva Agreement and all these things that happened. We can't go into the whole history. They spent years laying the groundwork for that.
Right.
And this was true in other successful revolutions, where people have been able to move things in a nonviolent way and lay the political framework for that. That's always better. And it's very costly if you have to turn to the military side. Now, the 60s were different from today, and that wasn't as clear to us, because the nature of the revolutions in the third world against colonialism and neocolonialism was taking the form of armed guerrilla wars. So that was a big influence on people.
And they were proving that it worked.
And it worked in certain situations to win certain things. It did work in terms of winning national liberation. It didn't work so well in terms of laying the groundwork for socialism, because the economics, the cost to those countries when they finally took power, the difficulty of still being in a world dominated by Western capital.
Yeah.
There was a little too much romanticism of what those movements could accomplish in the left in the United States. It was correct, I think, to understand heroism and the fact that North Americans, especially white North Americans, had things to learn from people in the global South, not just be the teachers and telling them what to do.
Yeah.
But there was a tendency to overestimate what could be accomplished in terms of building a new society in a poor country. I mean, Cuba and Vietnam have done some fantastic things considering the situations that they've had to face, but they're not exactly going to be totally inspirational to an American population that's used to a whole different standard of living and is just in a technologically and economically so much more developed society. So it's extremely complicated figuring all that stuff out, and we were young and stupid. I mean, 21, like you said, I mean, people my age, a couple years older, a couple years younger, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then Malcolm's assassinated, Martin Luther King's assassinated, the Panthers are assassinated, Robert Kennedy is assassinated, John Kennedy is assassinated, and there's these armed wars going on in the world. So, we got.
If I were 21 at that time, forget it. Look out. I mean, when we met Max, I was around that age, and I was being politicized by, 8 years of Bush and 2 wars. And I remember calling you up and being just so dejected. I think it might have been after Bush won again. And I was like, I don't know what to do. And I feel I'm so down. I feel so hopeless. And I think you were like, well, I remember what it was like turning on the TV and seeing, 1,000 more American soldiers killed in Vietnam or whatever it was. And there were days when I couldn't even look people in the eye. And I was like, it just you put me into perspective about how long this struggle has been. And it's hard to say that we're better because we're not in another Vietnam to that extent, right? But in some ways we are shifting gradually this tide. And I think you're right that it feels particularly volatile because it's this last gasp of whiteness that I do feel, people on the left, they dabble in this idea that all we need to do is foment revolution. Like all you need to do is kick the hornet's nest until we have to have a violent, overthrow. And I think some people saw Trump's election as a way to galvanize that revolution. And even Trump himself, it's like, and the ruling class and Fox News themselves, you're like, the way they speak, you're like, do you want a revolution? Like, do you want guillotines? Because you're acting like you want guillotines,
Yeah, they keep talking about Marxism and people being Marxists when there's, I would say the broad population in general who are marching for Black lives aren't doing so because, they read Capital, and after a while you kind of go like, you keep doing free advertising for Marx.
Marxism.
At some point, do you want this? Because it's almost accelerationism. Yeah.
Which is interesting. I don't know, Max, what are your thoughts on this? I have a theory about why the RNC keeps saying Marxism. I think it's because socialism, they ran all the tests up backwards and forwards, and it has a very positive connotation among the American youth and generally Americans.
And a very negative connotation amongst people of an older generation. And
Sure, but now they're turning to the word Marxism. They're just saying Marxism and Biden being controlled by Marxism. And I feel like it's because socialism's been too positively construed. But we were talking about whether it also has like incredibly racist undertones to it. Like, why do you think they're pulling out this word, dusting it off, just like so many young people are now who are turning towards Marxist theory?
Well, I mean, like you said, these terms have been racialized. I mean, they want to say that the liberal elites are coddling people of color and are stalking horses for, the takeover of America by the barbarians from the other, and they just keep trying any label you want. Liberals own the libs, Marxism. So they're going to throw every piece piece of mud at the wall and see what sticks. And for a whole generation, particularly an older white generation, the image of socialism or communism or Marxism is someone's going to come and take your car or take your house or tell you what to do.
Or a black guy is going to move into your neighborhood. That seems to be a big dog whistle.
Right. And there are people who, because the models of socialism that have existed so far have tended in an authoritarian direction, some worse than others, there's all kinds of people running around for whom that's a real experience. They know someone who fled Eastern Europe. They know someone who, this or that. If you're in Florida, they have their thing about this or that person in Latin America who allegedly was a dictator. I mean, look what happened with the red baiting of Karen Bass about having gone to Cuba and then all of that stuff, So it becomes it's just another way of being able to lump the white people who are in solidarity with the are participating in the anti-racist struggle. The old term, back in the Jim Crow days, you were just called an N lover, an N lover. And that doesn't quite. You need a different word for that. It's the same message. It's just that, they decided that saying that in the Republican National Convention might not be. Tim Scott would have to leave. So
exactly.
It's interesting. It's definitely Marxism has definitely been racialized by the right and also tied directly to Black Lives Matter, because the way I keep in touch with the boomer generation, the right-wing boomer generation online, is by reading comments on yahoo.com's news section. They love Yahoo. They're big fans. They've never heard of Google.
It's just what came with Microsoft.
It's just what came with Microsoft. They came with their AOL disk. They put in their disk and then they go to yahoo.com and they read news articles and comment. And one of the consistent comments that I read is people saying, and it's always the same language, Black Lives Matter leaders have admitted that they are trained Marxists. That's quotes, trained Marxists. And so if you do just like do a word search on Twitter for trained Marxist, and you will find
it would come up here in Max's book a lot. Well, there's a lot of trained Marxists in this book.
Well, that's the funny thing about it is I'm going like, they keep trying to connect Black Lives Matter and trained Marxists. First of all, I'm not really sure I think trained Marxist is shorthand for people who listen to podcasts, but I'm not really sure. But it just seems like a way of trying to.
No, it's shorthand for Soros.
It's shorthand for Soros, for sure. It's like there's a Soros connection, like an anti-Semitic thing. Like, obviously, these leaders need to be trained by the secret
they're not smart
Jewish
enough
cabal.
to do it by exactly.
But also, it just seems like a way to make Marxism synonymous with the movement for Black lives and its allies. So, to me, when I see the RNC focus on Marxism and hammering it home, it's like I hear the dog whistle very clearly as like all of the people you see on the streets, the Black people and the white allies and, people of all races and the transgender people, they are what we're talking about. That's Marxism. They're coming to your neighborhoods to yell at your dog.
They're going to reign supreme with their inclusivity and equality.
Yes,
they're going to subject you and enslave you to equality.
Right. Yeah.
And again, right. And that's because the insanity about white people losing power is they believe that equality is the worst thing that ever happened to them. They think that people of color are going to treat them the way they've treated people of color for thousands and thousands of years. Not true. Maybe that should happen, but probably not going to. The idea is actual democracy, is inclusivity, and and actually like a working class, an actual working class.
Yeah.
And I mean, the word Marxism, a lot of people are identifying as Marxist now.
Yeah.
Now, personally, I read Max's book when I came up in the anti-war movement. I definitely identify and still do as a little bit more anarchist. And I don't mean it's chaos and everything. I mean, hey, I look at the state, I look at state power, I look at, where communism has been implemented, and it's scary to me, right? I don't love all the authoritarian aspects of it. Maybe we want different government. Maybe we want anti-hierarchical government. Now, all of that is all theoretical. That's pie in the sky, never going to happen in my lifetime type of stuff.
Yeah, that's like conversations that the intelligentsia have over coffee.
Yeah, exactly.
As
at
opposed
Intelligentsia Coffee.
Yeah, at Intelligentsia Coffee, yeah.
But I am curious, how do you define Marxism? I mean, to me, it's just having a class analysis. But what does that mean to you? And why do you think people are now identifying with that sort of strangely, even though no party is trying to organize them. The Communist Party hasn't gone after these people, it's just, I mean, got the DSA, but yeah.
There's a couple things. The first thing on what you said is, people who want to believe the system is generally sound and the message that comes from the government and the ruling class, you think that if there's some problem or people protesting, it's due to some outside malevolent force that's coming in and disrupting things. So take your pick, outside agitators, Jews, communists. It's always the external that's come. Otherwise, all these people would be happy. What are they talking about? Or, maybe they would, raise their opinion, but they wouldn't be making trouble. So it's a standard trope, and it's just the words change. Anything to imply we're all good if it wasn't for this external other that's coming in and making trouble for us. Marxism, to me, Marxism is a way of, Marx used the term materialist conception of history, which I think is pretty good. The idea that things that happen in people's consciousness is determined by a lot of material things that develop over time and in history. And you look at those things as the underlying thing that shapes the society, not in a deterministic way, not that A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D in a simple way. I don't think Marxism is a science the same way that physics is a science or something like that. It's not that kind of.
Though it's been applied as a science poorly,
but it looks at things that way. Whether there's so it tells you something about the structures of society. It tells you something about what large groups of people who share a common condition are likely to do or likely to move and likely to, because of what their interests are, because of where they're located. And it tells you some things about how the economy works and the different dynamics of race, gender, and other things, if it's done well, how that intersects with economic things. It tells you a bunch of things about that.
Yeah.
But it doesn't tell you that much about how to do politics per se. It is not a prescription about what kind of organization you need, what are the strategy in a particular situation. The political leaders who have been successful at politics, whether they were revolutionaries or not, the ones who are Marxists have drawn upon Marxism to understand the society they live in, but they also got something about the art of politics. And that's a related but not a direct thing. And the idea that if you master Marxism, you're going to be able to lead things politically, to me, is not, I don't think that holds up. I don't think that holds up.
You wrote a whole book about that.
It's really helpful, but it's not the kind of panacea that all too many Marxists and all too many groups that have adopted one or another form of Marxism that we fell into thinking a certain way, which turned out to be more complicated than we thought.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what's so interesting about the moment we're living now and the ways that the people are warming to the word socialism is that there is a sense that no matter what, we would like to go through a socialist period in this country. We would like to move in a socialist direction. We know it's not going to necessarily be anti-capitalist, right? If you have Medicare for all, that doesn't mean like, all kinds of money making from the healthcare sector will completely disappear. Maybe so there'll be some stragglers, or maybe we just want to, we want one corner. We want one corner where money and capitalism doesn't run everything. We just want to
nationalize one thing.
It's just one thing.
Just nationalize one utility.
Exactly. Just one of the utilities. We're like bargaining in Monopoly here.
Yeah.
And I think that, and that only comes from reality. That doesn't come from having any kind of right analysis or reading a lot of Lenin or whatever. It comes from seeing just how unequal and how much ground we've lost, I think, in a lot of parts to this runaway Republican Party and a Democratic Party that has been, not non-complicit and not strong enough when it comes to either standing up to financial interests or the Republicans themselves, that we have such a skewed country, that we are so far gone in the hyper-capitalist. We hear the words late-stage capitalism all the time, as people kind of understand that. Oh yeah, late-stage capitalism, the gig economy where I'm never going to ever own a home in my life ever. That makes sense to a lot of young people staring down who know that, as if I'm going to even make as much money as my parents did. Forget about more.
Yeah.
If I can just get to sort of where they were in their heyday.
Where everyone is starting an OnlyFans for their cat.
Exactly.
Well, right now, I mean, there's all kind. For a lot of people, the terms change. There are people who want a people before profit society. Human needs come first. Socialism, democratic socialism, revolutionary socialism, Marxism. Unless you really dig in and want to get, here's what this is, here's what this is, here's what this is, and that's a pretty tough one because you can define anything you want in a book, but until it exists in the real world and you look at it, it doesn't, it's not real. So the whole layer of society that's figured out that when private profit is in command of everything, it's messed up. And they want some society where private profit is not in command of everything. And then within the left, people debate socialism, democratic socialism, revolutionary socialism, people before profit. I mean, all that stuff, which to me at this stage is it's an interesting question. I'm all for discussion of it. I wrote some things about it in my book, but it's not the right practical question. The practical question is what to do next. And it's related to where you want to go and what you think an ultimate solution is, but it's not collapsible into that in and of itself. The next stage, if we can, in the Depression, I remember going to Hyde Park and looking at the exhibits in the museum about the Depression and all this. And what was interesting to me, having read all this stuff about, the alignments and what the shortcomings were and this and that and the other. But the interesting thing about it was that they mobilized almost everybody who wanted to move the society forward and have the country get back on its feet, found a place to do something, whether it was artists, photographers, social workers, industrial workers, intelligentsia. They didn't all share an ideology. Some were communists, some were socialists, some were democratic liberal, but that coalition with all its problems and included a bunch of Dixiecrats, segregationist, racists, tried to move the country out of the mess that it was in. And
So
we weren't in leadership of that coalition. The Roosevelt administration was in leadership, and they were not socialists or they were not revolutionaries, but they wanted to get the country out of that mess in a certain way. And they knew they, at that stage, couldn't do it without the left and had to give something to the left. So we're entering a period that is likely to resemble that in some ways, which is we have to be ready to play the maximum role we can in mobilizing anybody who wants to get us out of the racial crisis, the climate crisis, the economic crisis, the militarism crisis, and create a different kind of world. If we can get a piece of political power and advance the kind of radical solutions that are really the only way that we're going to get out of this mess, and have our doors open for all kinds of other people, including some people who were our enemies in other states,
former Trump voters,
our enemies 10 years down the road, to move to the next stage and increase our power as we go along. And as we do that, hopefully it'll become a little clearer from our experience and the experience we'll learn about in other countries trying to do the same thing, what a different society would actually look like. I mean, Marx was very reluctant to make any predictions of what the hell socialism would actually look like until it was moving along. So I think our prospects for that are pretty good. Even a bunch of the mainstream commentators don't think we can just go back to the status quo before. I mean, I know, Biden says that, and Rahm Emanuel says that, and all kinds of people say that, but that is not a real option. We're either going to do Trumpism or we're going to head somewhere in another direction, not at the speed we want and not at the scale that the people listening to this show want. But you start going in that direction and hopefully you start picking up speed. If you actually can demonstrate some leadership. And there's some great leaders, people like AOC, Cori Bush, some of the new generation labor people that are coming along, the movement for Black Lives, watching some of the speakers and the rallies and the level of sophistication and the inclusiveness in who is leading. I mean, I came up in the time where the leaders were all guys in black leather jackets. This is totally different. It's a whole different vibe. So there's some people out there. I'm ready to get behind them. I mean, I'm an old guy.
Back in the 60s, was it like the person who had the black leather jacket would be the one to speak? You're like, well, I guess we got to pass the microphone to this guy. Look at him. He's got a jacket. And then that guy would stand on a car and it was like, what is it? Mario. Oh, I'm forgetting his last name.
Mario Savio. He didn't have a black jacket. I mean, people like Stokely Carmichael and Rap Brown and Huey, I mean, these were really talented people. They deserve to be in the leadership. But the point was there were as deserving people who were women and, who also deserved to be in the leadership, who were, pushed to the side and not given those opportunities. And if you were gay or lesbian or trans, it was just not an option. So it's not that people like Fred Hampton and others that I heard speak in the 60s, I mean, I'm not taking a single thing away from them. It's just you broaden out and include other people. That's exactly what's happening in today, the movement for Black Lives, to the extent
Max,
there's anybody steering this.
Last question about, I think there is doubt around whether the Democrats truly understand they have to change. And my hope is that Biden's decency pitch is just the tip of the iceberg, that he's doing that to get this elusive moderate Republican voter or repentant Trump voter. I am of the belief, because I refuse to be pessimistic about this, that there is a silent majority of repentant Trump voters who are not going to answer the phone and talk to a pollster.
The new silent majority is just people who are ashamed of their last vote.
I know, that's what I'm saying. But my feeling is like, he's pitching us on decency, which honestly, even if you're on the left, especially if you're on the left, you get, because we are truly the party and the people who have moral underpinnings. So, but I hope that once he gets there, this is not really a question, but I'm trying to make it sound like a question. Well, that I hope that once he gets there, he knows that it can't just be about decency. It has to be about, what is that New Deal plan? How are you going to make sure? Because everyone knows Trumpism was a symptom and not the actual illness. So what's that illness, and how do we cure that? Racism, classism, sexism, capitalism. Uh-huh. How do we cure those illnesses?
Well, we're in a period of tremendous change, and it's not possible to predict where different individuals are going to go. What's possible to predict is that there are certain social forces in motion that are going to push people and put different options on the table. And who's going to go which direction is undetermined. So in the 60s, there were surprises of people who moved from one side to the other, from the other side to our side, and from our side to the other side. People, even including elected officials and leaders, some of whom moved to the left, and others moved to the right. And you just don't know on the level of individual psychology, all kinds of things happen. I have no idea. I don't know these people. I don't know Biden. I don't know these folks. People can surprise you for good.
You gotta, Kamala, you gotta have a.
I've met a few of them. I have met a few of them, but I don't know them. But people surprise you. I mean, no one predicted, Franklin Roosevelt wasn't Franklin Roosevelt until afterwards.
Yeah.
And, Lincoln wasn't Lincoln until afterwards.
Yes.
And my friend who's went to teach nuclear war to war college, who he was until afterwards. Yeah. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I do think some people are going to come our way that will surprise us. And we shouldn't be so cynical, the idea that no one can change. I mean, look at Ramsey Clark. He was attorney general under Lyndon Johnson. And then he moves to the far left and he ends up, being, spending 20 years doing that. Yeah. Who predicted that? These things are not predictable on the level of individuals. I
think Barron is going to be a raging socialist. I think we can get Barron.
And some people who are on the left now are going to defect. That's the bottom line. And it's just, that's how life works. So I guess I'm still enough of a Marxist, or I could, to say that it's not about individuals. It's about the social forces, and then different people will play different roles. Of course, I hope all my friends play the great roles and do what they're doing, and I have certain preferences for this person or that person, just based on subjective shit. But that's not how the world works. It's not how the world works.
I'm sorry. I really appreciate you taking the time. We should wrap. I do want to say, funnily enough, we're writing a piece about American individualism right now for Newsbroke. I don't mean to plug this show, but Matt and I work on it. And the first piece we're doing is about American individualism and how we've really screwed ourselves by over believing in it because of, look at the coronavirus and sort of the ways that your quote unquote personal freedom should not be impaired because you have to wear a mask.
My individual right not to get my parents sick and kill them with a virus.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. But for sure, when you said I believe in collective power, that I think is what the right is saying when they say Marxist, is that they say, aha, you believe in common stuff. You believe in collective good. You believe in communities and schools and, like
libraries.
Exactly. You believe that you move as a group, that you're a nation.
Watching theater.
Yeah, that you're a family. Like all of the
playing team sports. I don't know. Sorry.
And then
guilty.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, love them all.
I mean, the NBA is Marxist right now.
Yeah.
But that's so, it's that you believe in momentarily or wonderfully putting aside your personal comfort in this moment because you see there's a greater good. There's a greater history to fight for. There's a greater community to fight for. And we all have much more in common than we have that separate us. So I don't need my personal freedom to have an AR-15 and not wear a mask and go around, brutalizing people. So anyway, I'm bringing it full circle. Guys, Revolution in the Air, 60s radicals turned to Lenin, Mao, and Che. It's so good. It's so dense. Even if you just make it through the first couple chapters, it's so good. And Max goes into all kinds of what Marxist-Leninism meant on the ground for people who were radicalized by the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement and the feminist movement, the LGBTQ movements, and how they then worked in cadre Marxist-Leninist organizations. And what was that like? Was it great? Was it bad? How did a lot of it, it was very, it seems like it was enriching, rapidly politicizing, and there was a political home for people, which I think is really important to have a political home. It's not enough to just be alone on the internet. We all want to find a political home. And I hope you all think that the Bituation Room is your political home for lack of an actual organization. Although there are so many Movement for Black Lives, DSA, all the organizations this podcast has supported. I'm wrapping it up. Max, you don't go nowhere ever. And please come back on this show.
Stay here forever.
Stay here forever. No, but you always so good to talk to you. And I hope to talk to you before November, but if not, I will see you on the other side of that victory against fascism. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Everybody, not only...
guys.
Yes, and I just want to say also, Max regularly writes about politics happening now, not just in the 60s, on Organizing Upgrade, orgup.net, is it? .com?
Organizingupgrade.com.
Organizingupgrade.com.
Either one.
Okay,
Yeah.
either one. Organizing Upgrade, Max has great columns, as do many contributors to Organizing Upgrade, as well as you can find their lives on Facebook. They do a lot of live, awesome discussions with great organizers and political thinkers. So check them out. Thank you so much, Max. You take care.
You too. Thanks.
All right, and that's been the Bituation Room.
Oh, it's been great. I've had a great time. Why are you poking me?
I'm just pointing. This is my bonus babe here.
What's up?
Bonus babe. Follow bonus babe at what?
Oh, on Instagram at Matt Lieb Jokes.
You're pushing the IG.
I'm pushing the IG because I just those matter more than Twitter. So please follow me on Instagram. But I'm also on Instagram at Matt Lieb or Twitter.
All right, thank you guys. We'll see you Sunday with NATO Green. And make sure to be there 6 o'clock, 9 p.m. Eastern. And remember, don't just bitch about it. Be about it. Bye.